Hello and welcome to Theology Unleashed, the channel where Eastern theology meets Western skepticism. I'm Arjuna, and today I've got two special guests on to discuss intelligent design and accusations that it's pseudoscience, as well as the demarcation problem. So Stephen Meyer is the well-known director of the Discovery Institute, as well as the author of his most recent book, Return of the God Hypothesis, and the well-known book, Darwin's Doubt. And Seth Hart has been doing research related to this topic. And I'll hand it over to Seth to get us started. Thanks for coming on, guys.
Thank you.
Absolutely. Glad to be with you guys.
Yeah, Professor Meyer, it's great to have you and great to speak with you. Now, everywhere I go now, it seems like everyone's talking about your book. It's definitely made an impact, especially the provocative title, Return of the God Hypothesis. Would you mind just giving us like an overall thesis? What does it mean that the God hypothesis is returned? Where did it go, and how's it come back?
Yeah, sure. The title invites a story, and I can tell that story briefly. And that is that modern science arose in a decidedly theistic or theological milieu, in particular in Western Europe, in the period roughly between 1500 and 1700, but many historians of science push that back a bit further now into the late medieval period, where systematic methods of investigating nature were first developed and then later applied by figures like Newton and Boyle and Kepler and others. And this period of the scientific revolution was a period in which the investigation of nature was seen as a theological project. It was seen as a way of revealing the handiwork and the glory of God. One of the great historians of science, contemporary historians of science, is Rodney Stark, who wrote a wonderful book called For the Glory of God, published with Princeton University Press, about the period of the scientific revolution. And these scientists brought to bear decidedly theological presuppositions about nature and about the nature of the divine being in investigating nature, presuppositions about the order of nature, about its contingency on the will of the creator, and especially the intelligibility of nature. They believed that nature could be understood, that it had patterns of order and design that could be understood because it had been made by a rational intellect, and that the same rational intellect had made our minds in his image. And then further, once beginning to work on studying nature, many of these scientists also believed that they were seeing evidence of the handiwork of the creator, evidence of design. You see this, for example, in the general scholium to the Principia, the great theological epilogue that Newton wrote to his great masterwork of physics, where he explicated the theory of gravity. He there develops a very sophisticated fine-tuning argument for the existence of, as he puts it, an intelligent and powerful being. So right up into the 18th century, you have scientists making these design arguments, even into the 19th century. But there's a shift, and by the late 19th century, you've had a series of new ideas and theories about the origin of the solar system, the origin of planet Earth and its great geological features, the origin of life and the origin of new forms of life, with Darwin's theory of the theory of evolution by natural selection being one of the most important naturalistic ideas about where things came from. And so by the end of the 19th century, you get this sense that you can tell the whole story of where everything came from as a seamless, materialistic, naturalistic narrative. And you have other figures like Marx, and then a little bit later Freud. So the big worldview questions that religion always answered, where did we come from? Where are we going? What do we do about the human condition? What do we do about human guilt? That are now all being addressed by secular, materialistic thinkers, Darwin, Marx, and Freud, for example, all of whom are claiming that their answers are based on science. And then, so the story of the book is a rise, fall, rise story. Science arises in a theistic milieu. It's the science of the 19th century. It takes a decidedly materialistic turn. But now in the 20th century and 21st century, I guess we're into a new one, we've had a series of key discoveries that are either bringing that theistic perspective back, or should be, and in particular, discoveries about the origin of the universe, its fine-tuning, and the intricate complexity, indeed, the informational complexity of living systems. So I tell the story of three big discoveries that I think have collectively or jointly theistic implications.
So, Stephen, your work hasn't exactly been well received by the scientific community. Perhaps you could say something about your experiences with some of your colleagues pushing back on your work.
Well, I'm not so sure that it hasn't been well received by the scientific community, because the scientific community does not speak with a univocal voice. And one of the things that surprised me with the new book was the really very complimentary endorsements I got for the book from very prominent scientists in physics, in astrophysics, in cosmology, in biology. I think the God hypothesis is coming back, and I think interest in intelligent design is growing. So yeah, there's been a lot of scientists who have vigorously contested my work, but many of them are, those folks are the kind of ideological, very heavily ideological spokespersons for official science. Lawrence Krauss doesn't like my work very well. Richard Dawkins doesn't like it very well, but I think in some ways that new atheistic voice that was so dominant and so it was jamming the airways, if you will, from say 2006, 2007 for a decade or so, is starting to lose some credibility, and people I think are much more open to the idea that we have that science is not supporting a materialistic worldview, and it may well be pointing to design and to an ultimate designer.
I've heard the materialism attitude, the paradigm of science compared to, a dialectic pendulum swing kind of thing. So you had irrational religion at some stage, and that created a rift with science at some point, and then that created a momentum which pushed in the direction of this sort of hard materialism, because everyone, was running away from all the witch burning and nonsense that went on prior to that. And so it's like a rubber band that you release, and or like a ball that gets hit, and it's got so much momentum to go in one direction, and at some point it hits the wall and starts heading back in the other direction because it's just a reactionary thing. So the question is, do you think if you published Darwin's Doubt today rather than when you did publish it, it would have got the same blowback that it did?
Well, the interesting thing about I would say, first of all, these maybe there are changes of fashion in intellectual matters as well as anything else. I don't know if they're always cyclical, or the pendulum describes them. Usually, the story is a lot more complex than what people tell us. For example, the late 19th century historiography that gave us the idea that science and religion are in conflict. Books like The Warfare Between Science and Christianity turned out to be very simplistic and largely false as far as their portrayal of science. Even the story I'm telling about the rise of scientific materialism in the 19th century I think is certainly true, but it needs to be qualified. One of the greatest scientists of the 19th century was James Clerk Maxwell, who was a devout Presbyterian Christian who was also a staunch critic of Darwin. He's widely regarded as the third greatest physicist in the history of the discipline, after Einstein and Newton. There's always it's hard to tell a seamless story about this, but the Darwin's Doubt had very few, I think, significant scientific critics. We had a couple of, there were some young grad students who wrote pre-written reviews that were posted on Amazon the night the book was first released. But the most significant review I had was from Charles Marshall in Science, and a fellow Kiwi, a wonderful guy. I've had a chance to debate with him and have had further correspondence with him. And his critique I thought was very well considered, but it also raised some issues that I think exposed the weakness of the modern neo-Darwinian or even extended synthesis models of evolution. He argued that I had misunderstood the idea that there was a need for information to build new forms of life, but in the process of making his critique, he subtly presupposed several pre-existing unexplained sources of information in the origin of major body plans. I've pointed that out, and I think that counter-argument has withstood scrutiny. So, but I do think minds are opening. I think there have been a number of prominent scientists who have been moved towards the ID position because of some of the arguments that I developed in Darwin's Doubt. So, I do think you're right. Things are moving in a more open direction, and that the interest in this idea has gone international. It's increasingly mainstream, and I think there's a lot of momentum behind it.
So the idea with this topic is that instead of having a scientific debate over whether the God hypothesis is indicated by the evidence, people will just say it's not scientific. It's not worth having the debate. And so, Seth, do you want to say any comments on that before we launch into it?
Yeah, kind of dovetailing off that. I'll go ahead and play a skeptic. Now let's say with the title of the book, my initial thought was, is ID showing its hand, right? Because prior books and the prior position of the intelligent design movement has been, this isn't an argument for God, it's an argument for design writ large. So with this newest book, you're saying Return of the God hypothesis, that you're putting within, I'm assuming that you put it sort of within the overall trajectory of intelligent design. Are you in a sense showing your hand that by arguing specifically for theism?
Well, I'm certainly revealing my perspective on what the implications of intelligent design are. I don't think it's within the ID research framework in the sense that intelligent design per se as a method of design detection and as a method that has been applied to biology necessarily implies a transcendent intelligence. But that was the very question that motivated me to write the book. After I wrote 2 books arguing that the evidence that we have in living systems points to a designing mind of some kind, naturally people ask the question, well, who do you think the designing intelligence is, or what can we tell about that designing intelligence from science? And I was purposely modest in drawing conclusions about that question in the first 2 books, because I think from biology alone, it's hard to answer that question. But what I did in this book was say, I don't think it's impossible to answer that question if we look at other classes of evidence from physics and cosmology in particular. And so I brought to bear those other classes of evidence in assessing that larger question. And that was the purpose of writing the book. I've long said that I thought that intelligent design had theistic friendly implications. And in this book, I drew out what I thought those implications are or were. I'm quite happy to say the God hypothesis is not necessarily a scientific hypothesis. If you want to call it a metaphysical hypothesis, I think that's perfectly fine. You'll find in our discussion as we discuss the whole issue of demarcation, I'm very much unconcerned with the question of how we classify ideas. I'm much more concerned with whether or not they're true or likely to be true based on the evidence. So, a lot of people have wanted to kind of motive monger this debate and think that they can settle it by prosecuting someone of having a theistic or a theological motive, or for that matter, a materialistic one. I don't think that matters on either side. I think what matters is what does the evidence say and what does our best reasoning lead us to conclude about the evidence. So I'm perfectly happy to allow other proponents of intelligent design to say, hey, we want to, all we're willing to say is that we see evidence of a designing mind of some kind. But I wanted to answer the question that a lot of people had put to me. What do you think about the question of the identity or attributes of the designer as we can detect them from everything we might want to look at in nature?
Right. So we seem to be running up against a barrier here, where it seems like, say, a more materialistic-minded, non-ID critic would say, an intelligent mind doesn't count as a scientific hypothesis, and anything past that also sort of lands on the side of pseudoscience. Whereas it seems like in this work, and with what you just communicated, that you're saying intelligent design falls on the side of science, but whenever we get to theism, though, that's when we move beyond science into metaphysics. Would that be a correct caricature?
Well, perhaps. The thing is, this whole debate presupposes, this whole discussion presupposes that there's an agreed definition of science, and that deciding whether or not something meets that definition is an important intellectual exercise. And I don't think it is. I think what's important is whether or not a proposition is true or false, and what we can decide about that question of truth or falsity based on the evidence and our best methods of reasoning. Let me just reframe this a little bit just to start. There's a branch of philosophy known as metaphysics. Metaphysics is the study of what is the case, the study of being or ontology, what exists. Well, scientists are very concerned about what is the case, what exists, what's true about the world. The standard model of particle physics is a theory about existence, what is and isn't, what are the fundamental elements of nature. So right away you can see there's a problem trying to draw a firm line of demarcation between science and philosophy. And in the classical sense, science has simply meant scientia. It's referred to knowledge. Can we have knowledge of God? Can we have knowledge of a designing intelligence? Can we have knowledge of other minds? Quite possibly the answer to those questions is yes, even as we can also have knowledge of the material world. So I think this whole attempt to label competing theories as pseudoscientific has been largely a rhetorical exercise or a semantic one, neither of which gets us to fundamental questions of truth.
Mm. And when you talk about whether or not theology is a science, you run into Karl Barth, and one of the first questions he asks in Church Dogmatics, the most important theologian perhaps of the 20th century, is theology a science? And he means that not as a natural science, just as a thing, can we know about God? So yeah, I find myself on board, but since I'm playing skeptic here, let me push this a little bit further.
Keep bringing. Bring these objections. These are the things that really hang people up, But yeah. I think these are weak kinds of objections. The objections that are significant and weighty are ones that are about evidential matters and explanatory power. But I think these are very common things. Intelligent design isn't science because it's invokes an unobservable entity. Intelligent design isn't science because it's not testable. Intelligent design isn't science because it's not falsifiable. Intelligent design isn't science because it involves an unrepeatable event. Well, take those one by one, and what you find is that a lot of other things that we think of as science either invoke unobservables or aren't testable in a particular manner or don't involve repeatable events, or turn it around, there's ways in which intelligent design is quite testable, and testable in the same way as its competing hypotheses. For example, evolutionary theories about the origin of life or the origin of new forms of life. So I've written a piece called The Methodological Equivalence of Design and Descent, where descent is the shorthand for Darwinian evolution, showing that both of these theories fail to meet rigid standards of scientific status that apply to, for example, bench science, where you're repeating experiments under controlled laboratory conditions, but both meet standards of scientific methodology that are appropriate to historical inquiries about causal origins of events in the remote past. And that's another reason why drawing a firm line of demarcation between science and non-science, whether you want to pejoratively label that pseudoscience or philosophy or religion or something else, why those attempts to demarcate failed, because there isn't just one method of scientific reasoning. We have historical scientific methods of reasoning. This has been a major focus of my work, that are very different from, or in some ways different from, the kinds of historic or methodological protocols that are used in experimental sciences, You have sciences of classification. You have sciences that are purely theoretical. You have sciences that are attempting to establish causation. You have sciences that are attempting to formulate general laws. General laws and causes turn out not to be the same thing. So you've got multiple modes of scientific reasoning. And when you try to define science with a singular methodology, or by reference to a singular methodology, you end up inevitably leaving out things that we already regard as scientific. So it's a bit more complicated question than people typically assume. Usually what philosophers of science are now concluding is that the attempt to use demarcation to settle issues is largely a rhetorical strategy that is not supported by good, rigorous analysis of the way science actually works.
Right. So if you want, actually, let me wage this against you first. Full disclosure, I am a Firebindian. I am sort of against method. Any sort of established method. I think liberating science is a key. But I know for a lot of people that's a huge hiccup. The idea that science doesn't have a sort of univocal method that you can use across each of the different various disciplines of the natural sciences. How, if we're to take these philosophers of science seriously, how do we not end up with just chaos, and that we're allowing in alchemy or astrology or anything else just can become various forms of science?
Well, again, the key word there is allowing in. What are we allowing? What are we allowing into? The reason we don't think alchemy works is that there were experiments about alchemy, and the results didn't turn out. So it wasn't that it was pseudoscience. It's that the evidence showed that it was false. Now, if by pseudoscience we mean the evidence shows that something is false, that's a very tractable claim to analyze. But usually when people invoke the term pseudoscience, they mean it doesn't qualify as science according to some abstract definition that also relieves us from the necessity of investigating by reference to evidence whether or not the theory is false. We can tell because it has certain features that mean that it's inherently unscientific, that it's unscientific by definition. But to make that kind of a claim, we have to have a definition of what we mean by science. And the definitions that have been offered in the enterprise of demarcation invariably fail to discriminate the inherent scientific status of competing theories. What does discriminate the truth or falsity of those competing theories is an analysis of the evidence in accord with some set of established methods of reasoning or protocols that apply to specific disciplines. But the problem there is that many of those specific protocols or methods are different from one discipline to another, and so they don't lend themselves to a single methodological characterization of science that would in turn allow us to apply a definition of science across the board in a way to settle debates. One of the I'll let you talk. I'm going on these. These are subtle philosophical issues that require longer answers than is normal in an interview. But you guys are asking great questions. So
I was just going to say, one question is, even if we did work can figure out that we were happy to call alchemy pseudoscience, does that mean we think nobody should have ever investigated the possibility of alchemy? It's pseudoscience. Don't look at it. Don't experiment. It's not scientific. It's not worth our time.
Yeah, well, it's a great question. And from roughly the same era, there was a theory of a chemistry theory known as phlogiston. And we thought that we talked about dephlogisticated air, and then that was replaced by the oxygen theory. Well, without the theory of phlogiston, we probably wouldn't have gotten to the idea of oxygen. But it required investigation, and we dispensed with alchemy because the experiments around it eventually didn't seem to be very fruitful, and they didn't work. So, and later we got deeper, understanding of atomic theory that explained why they wouldn't work, and that was helpful too. So science progresses as scientists argue about how to interpret evidence. And one of the problems I have with the whole use of the pejorative label pseudoscience, or we've got lots of pejorative labels that have been put on intelligent design. I'm also known as a creationist in a cheap tuxedo, though I paid quite a lot for my tuxedo and I'm wearing it to a party tomorrow night, is that if you shut down the process of debate and competing or evaluation of competing theories, however crazy you might think your opponent's theory is, you're shutting down the process of science, because one of the key features of scientific advance is an openness to competing ideas as ways of explaining or interpreting evidence, and the need for scientists to argue about how to best interpret that evidence. And the pejorative term, the label, the accusation of pseudoscience is typically being used as a way of shutting down discourse about competing scientific ideas. And therefore, in a certain kind of ironic way, the use of that pejorative label is profoundly anti-scientific.
Well, I couldn't agree more, but...
well, you're not being a very good devil's advocate then. You've got to disagree more, right?
Yeah, well, I'm a Christian. Any relation to the devil I can avoid, I try to.
Well, there you go.
Yeah. So switching back to the side of Satan, let me go ahead and press a few specific questions, if that's all right.
Absolutely.
Number one, and this is going to be the biggest one you probably hear. You mentioned invisible entity. What I hear more often than not is you cannot introduce supernatural agents into science. Science is methodological naturalism, and even the implication of an intelligent design is a way of sneaking in supernatural causation, which is then we're back to falsifiability and verifiability. But just on that topic alone, what do you have to say?
Well, notice the phrasing that you're forced to use to pose that question. Sneaking in. What's exactly meant by that? I don't want to sneak in anything or keep anything out. What I want to do is investigate nature and figure out what's true about it. I want to know how it works. I want to know how it functions. I want to know what the regularities are that it exhibits. And I also want to know something about its origins. And so if the best explanation for example, the exquisite information storage, transmission, and processing system and the digital code it contains within the cell is that there was a master programmer for life, that if there were the best explanation is that there was a designing mind that is responsible for the information bearing properties of even the simplest living cells, then I want to know about that. And I want to evaluate the evidence and see whether or not that proposition is true. Sneaking in just makes it sound like something really nefarious is being done, when in fact, people are just asking a big important question. How did life arise? And is it more likely that it arose from undirected material processes or from a designing intelligence? That's a legitimate question. That's an important question. It goes back all the way to the ancient Greeks, if not before. And why shouldn't we investigate that? Investigating both possible answers isn't sneaking anything into anything where it doesn't belong. It's just doing good thinking and being open to thinking about the biggest and most important questions. And if it happens that the evidence points to A, a designing intelligence, and B, a designing intelligence that has the attribute, for example, of transcendence, then we have something like a God hypothesis, in which case that's a fascinating conclusion to come to. Maybe it's true, maybe it's false. I've argued that that's precisely the best explanation for an ensemble of evidence, for a suite of evidence that we have about biological, physical, and cosmological origins. When you look at not only the evidence of design in living cells, but also the evidence of design in the fine-tuning of the very fabric or the most fundamental parameters of the universe. And then when we look at the evidence that we have that the physical universe itself, as best we can tell, had a beginning in time and space, and also a beginning of matter and energy. Those three pieces of evidence, I've argued in my new book, are best explained by a designing intelligence that has the attribute of transcendence, and because it's intelligence, self-consciousness, awareness, and also a willingness to act within the creation after the beginning. To me, that sounds an awful lot like theism, and so I think that's an exciting conclusion if it's true. And if people want to say, well, because we're talking about a deity now, that's a metaphysical hypothesis. Okay, call it metaphysical. Is it based on scientific evidence? Yes. So is it also scientific? Depends on how you want to define science. But is it true is really the important question.
Oh, but Professor Meyer, you've said evidence points to at least a couple times in that last thing. But everyone knows Karl Popper showed that evidence should be falsifiable. And the problem with intelligent design theory is it's not falsifiable. You can always posit that an intelligent agent created something. There's no way to completely falsify that ever. So therefore, we can't include it into the realm of evidence, at least not scientific evidence.
Well, Popper said that theories must be falsifiable. Unfortunately, they must be falsifiable to qualify as being scientific. Unfortunately, very few philosophers of science now accept his version of the demarcation question, and they do so for very good reasons. Let me give you just a good example, an example that in a sense falsifies the falsification criterion. After the Principia, where it was published, there were predictions made about where you should find the planets based on Newton's laws of gravity. There were some anomalies where the planets weren't quite moving like you would expect if Newton's universal law was true and if there were 7 planets. But it was later determined that there was another planet, Neptune, out there beyond Uranus, and its existence created a gravitational pull that created some previously unexpected perturbations. Now, Newton didn't reject his theory because of the anomalies that were present in it. He made some predictions. They didn't come exactly quite true. Further Newtonians didn't either. Does that mean that Newtonian physics wasn't a scientific theory? That Newton's theory of gravity wasn't a scientific theory? No. The unwillingness to reject a theory on the basis of one failed prediction is not a hallmark of a failed scientific theory. Oftentimes, auxiliary hypotheses can be added to an original theory to help account for the data that weren't present before, and oftentimes there are good reasons to accept the auxiliary hypotheses. Sometimes, however, we invent so many auxiliary hypotheses that theories get very convoluted, very unparsimonious in the Occam sense, and eventually scientists think there must be a simpler explanation. Is that an example of Popper's idea of falsification? Well, not exactly. It might be an example of what Lakatos called a failed research program. So falsification itself hasn't stood up well as a good way of defining science. I think that rather than falsification by prediction, a better characterization of how scientists reason is the idea of inference to the best explanation, where both predictions and explanations of already known facts are taken into account in assessing the overall explanatory power of a scientific theory or explanation. And on that score, I think intelligent design fares very well. It doesn't mean that the theory isn't testable, because you can have an accumulation of anomalies that eventually cause someone or scientists to reject a theory. But intelligent design does a very good job of explaining the key facts that it's been formulated to explain, and a better job, in my estimation, than competing Darwinian views or chemical evolutionary views, for example, the origin of the information that's necessary to produce the first living cell, which was the argument I made for intelligent design in my first book, Signature in the Cell. So it also is the case, however, that intelligent design does make predictions. It was out of a design framework that many of the scientists of the last decade or so began to generate the prediction that what was previously thought to be junk DNA by neo-Darwinists was in fact importantly functional, and subsequent investigations of those long non-coding regions of the DNA have turned out to confirm that prediction of intelligent design. So there's actually a number of ways in which intelligent design is testable, even though the neither intelligent design proponents nor Darwinians or proponents of Darwinian evolution or many other scientists try to adhere strictly to Popper's notion of falsification by a single failed prediction.
Yeah. As Arjuna will know, I've used that exact Newtonian illustration in a previous video that I've had with him as an example of why falsification doesn't work. I've also used an illustration, the hypothesis all metals dissolve in some sort of acid. It seems like a scientific hypothesis, but it's neither falsifiable nor is it confirmable. But it definitely has the appearance of a scientific hypothesis. So even falsification and confirmation together don't seem to get at what science is trying to deal with.
Well, and one of the problems with the falsification idea was that it's deeply counterintuitive, because scientists really do want to know what's true. They don't want to. The idea that if all a scientist is trying to do is formulate a theory and then try to prove it wrong. No, scientists are trying to figure out what's true about the world. They want to know what is the case. And so I think this characterization of science is trying to make inferences about the best explanations, and sometimes the explanatory postulates also generate predictions as well. So there's nothing wrong with the idea that scientists are making predictions, but there are some sciences that make very few or no predictions, and many of the historical sciences are principally concerned with explaining what happened in the remote past, and they have expectations about what sort of evidence you might find, but they're not making predictions about what will happen in the future under controlled conditions. They're trying to explain facts that we already know by positing competing explanations of those facts, and then assessing those explanations against our knowledge of cause and effect, and against the evidence that we have on hand already. So again, you have this. You have various types of methods of investigating nature that characterize what we call science generally, and it's difficult to define science by reference to one set of those methods, and then and I think it's a bit it's not a fair way to go about things to use one characterization of the methods of science to disqualify some other type of science.
Yeah, I'm kind of reminded of when Newton said hypothesis non fingo. I do not, bring a hypothesis. And I'm trying to imagine him trying to get published in a modern day science journal with that methodology.
Well, the context of that quotation is very interesting, because he said he didn't feign to know the cause. He didn't pretend to know the cause of gravitational attraction. But he said, I'm doing something different than that. You may want me to get the cause. That's one type of science. But what I'm doing is I'm describing gravitational motion, and I can do that very precisely, mathematically. In fact, I can formulate a law that describes how that motion occurs. But I don't know what causes the action at a distance. That's above my pay grade, in a sense, is what he was saying. That's a different question. But notice, those are two different questions. What are the laws of nature, and what causes a specific phenomena? Sometimes we can link those. We can say there is an underlying cause that we can understand that's responsible for a regularity, but sometimes we know the regularities without knowing the cause. Doesn't mean in the latter case that we're not doing science.
Yeah, I find that interesting, because there's been I'm doing a terrible job of being a devil's advocate, but there has been a rash of philosophers of science, philosophers of biology, who've talked about how we need to get Darwinism out of the idea of being causal. It's merely statistical. It's merely a mapping. And it's the statistical interpretation of fitness. So I'm thinking of like Dennis Walsh and Tim Lewins and a few others who've been making this argument. And I just find that quite interesting, because it seems like, you nearly have two different agendas. You have a Newtonian agenda, which is, no, it's just here to map patterns. But then you have maybe a more Baconian objective, which is trying to find causes. And that might be a little bit of an overgeneralization, but...
A really interesting point you raise. One of the objections to intelligent design is it doesn't explain by natural law. But Newton didn't explain by natural law. He described phenomena using a natural law. And historical scientists or sciences generally don't explain by natural law. They explain by positing past events that have causal properties, past causal events that cause things. And events and laws aren't the same thing. Laws are statements of regularities about what generally happens when certain antecedents are present, and then what follows from them. This is a major focus in my PhD dissertation, the difference between laws and causes. So one of the maybe the easiest ways to defend intelligent design against the claim that it's unscientific is the way I chose to defend it in the two previous books I did, Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, which was to point out that I used, in making the inference to intelligent design, the same historical scientific method of reasoning that Darwin used in The Origin of Species. Darwin was using a method of multiple competing hypotheses, or inference to the best explanation. He was actually explicit about that in defending the theory against various kinds of demarcation arguments that were being leveled against him by physicists. And part of that method involved evaluating the possible explanations against our knowledge of cause and effect. It was called the vera causa criterion. And Darwin was self-consciously using this method that's been shown by a number of historians of biology. And so the idea is that if you want to explain an event in the remote past, you posit multiple competing hypotheses, and you elect that hypothesis which best explains the evidence, where best is determined by our knowledge of cause and effect, by what Lyell called causes now in operation, our uniform and repeated experience of the cause and effect structure of the world. And the case I made for intelligent design used precisely that method. I show that when we find specified complexity or information in that specific technical sense, digital code roughly, and we find enough of it, we know of only one kind of cause that produces that effect, and that cause is intelligence. And so when we have a case where there's only one type of cause for a given effect, we can retrodict or infer back in time to the existence of the cause from the effect. And I self-consciously applied that method by valuing other possible causal explanations for the origin of information, those based on chance, those based on law-like necessity, and those that combine the two, and showed that each of those types of explanations lacked causal adequacy, which is a key criterion of a successful historical scientific explanation. So the argument I made with respect to the demarcation objection was, well, that's fine if you want to say that if you want to say intelligent design is not scientific because it doesn't meet some specific demarcation criterion, then you'll have to say that Darwinian evolution or chemical evolutionary theory, its competitor explanations, are not scientific as well, because it turns out I'm using the exact same method of reasoning that scientists who have advanced those theories have used. And typically, the only way to make the intelligent design isn't science claim stick is to use a standard of scientific reasoning that invokes a method that's not relevant to investigating historical questions. So, yeah, it's true. We've posited an entity that's that may not produce things in a rigidly repeatable way. But as you just mentioned, Darwinian evolution involves a mechanism that invokes random mutations that are not repeated in a rigidly regular way either. So you have this kind of I wrote another piece called "What's Sauce for the Goose is Sauce for the Gander." If you apply the same standards to competing theories of origins, whether they involve intelligent design or strictly materialistic processes, either the standards you apply, either disqualify both theories or they affirm both theories, but in no case do they discriminate between the two.
Here's an argument. You're positing an explanation which you don't have an explanation for. Who created God?
What was the replicator that produced the first self-replicator? I mean, many theories are proximate in the explanations that they posit without providing an ultimate explanation. We can posit the standard model of particle physics as an explanation for lots of physical phenomena, without having an explanation for where all the particles came from. In every system of thought, and there's a different riff on the who designed the designer objection, and that is every system of thought has to start with some ultimate, what philosophers call primitive explanation, the thing from which everything else comes. The who designed the designer explanation says that positing a mind is illegitimate because you haven't explained the origin of the mind. But if you're a materialist, you have to posit self-existing, eternally self-existing matter and energy as the prime reality from which everything else came. And you can say, well, what produced that? And the answer, if you're a strict materialist, is, well, it was eternal and self-existing. It's the thing from which everything else came. What I argue in the new book, Return of the God Hypothesis, is that the evidence we have from cosmology suggests that the primitive, the prime reality posited by theism, provides a better explanation than the prime reality posited by materialism, because we actually have evidence that the physical world of matter, space, time, and energy began a finite time ago, and therefore that materialism is a crummy candidate to be the thing from which everything else came, and in particular that we have evidence that suggests that it wasn't here eternally, that matter and energy were not here eternally.
One way I've heard described is that
Go ahead.
Materialists attribute inconceivable potency to matter, whereas theists attribute inconceivable potency to God. And yeah, I guess the question is, where's the more adequate place to point it? Where does the evidence point?
Yeah, and exactly. But notice there's an equivalency there between materialism and theism, because they're competing explanatory systems of thought. You could call them worldviews or metaphysical systems of thought. You don't want to call them scientific, that's fine. But I think science allows us, then this is the fascinating thing about these developments in 20th century cosmology, physics, biology, and other fields, is that scientific discoveries are actually enabling us to adjudicate the competing explanatory power of competing metaphysical or worldview systems. And that's the argument that I develop. I develop a way of doing that in the new book and argue that theism provides the best overall explanation for these big discoveries we've made about biological and cosmological origins.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add, even on a more local level, I'm just thinking, where did birds come from? Well, they evolved from theropod dinosaurs. Well, you can't say that because you haven't told me where the theropod dinosaurs came from. Well, they evolved from archosaurs. Well, where did they come from? And if you take that logic consistently at all, you would need to have a full explanation of everything before you even had a single explanation.
Of anything, brilliantly. Right. And the thing is, in other words, there's so many counterexamples to that alleged demarcation criterion. If applied consistently, it would disqualify most of science, not just the theory of intelligent design.
Yeah, my experience with the demarcation problem debate is it's a nice kind of invective to throw around in order to stop having a debate. You just give a dog a name and hang it kind of thing, in order to avoid having the debate. But when you actually examine, like in analytic philosophy, you need to be very precise in your definitions of things so you can know what you're talking about and examine, is this idea coherent? Does it stand up? And when you do that with these demarcation problem arguments, you find that they have no substance at all. It works as long as you don't question it, but as soon as you try to define it with precision, you find that there's no substance there.
The whole thing falls apart. That's very well said, Arjuna. Invective, that was the word I was looking for a minute ago. That's how it's used as invective. That's exactly right. So it's a cudgel with which to bludgeon your opponent, but it doesn't. But the same cudgel can be used to bludgeon the person who's doing the bludgeoning. So it's best that we just set those down and have a serious and respectful discussion about what's true.
I do. I want to throw this way, and I apologize ahead of time, but this will come up if I don't bring it up. Well, we talk about competing explanations, and on the one hand, we do have. I mean, we'll be overt and we'll say we're appealing to an intelligent design in God, and on the other hand, we have a naturalistic hypothesis. Well, even if God can explain something, he can always explain everything. God is the sort of universal explanatory mechanism that can always account for everything. Whereas any sort of naturalistic hypothesis will always be simpler. So even if we don't have a good naturalistic hypothesis, we shouldn't appeal to theism just for that sake and that sake alone. You might compare it to like a magical fairy that can always explain everything. So I'm bordering on God of the gaps here, but I also want to include that concept of simplicity, because I hear that a lot, that because natural explanations are always simpler, they're more explanatorily like narrow than theism, that those should always be preferred, and even in the lack of one.
Yeah, there's two different things that are being said in that. The first is that the God hypothesis, or even let's just take a more narrow, generic design hypothesis, explains too much. It has too much explanatory power, and therefore it can always be invoked and justified. But then there's also the question of simplicity. Let's take the simplicity or parsimony objection first. One of the key arguments I make in the book is that modern scientific atheism or scientific materialism is starting to get very weird, in the Occam's sense of unparsimoniously weird. So to explain, there's a lot of scientists who will now acknowledge that we're nowhere close to understanding the origin of the first life by reference to any undirected chemical evolutionary processes, and some of them have invoked designing intelligence, but an alien intelligence. Francis Crick proposed that in a little book in 1981 called Life Itself. Dawkins floated the idea in an interview with Ben Stein in 2008. Hoyle and Wickramasinghe proposed this. We also have the idea of the multiverse that has been proposed as an explanation for the fine-tuning. We have cyclical conformal cosmology models positing an infinite number of previous cycles of the universe, or an infinite number of future new universes coming out of things. And then we have very abstract mathematical concepts being formulated under the heading of quantum cosmology, notions of superspace and imaginary time being invoked to explain the origin of the universe. So modern materialism, scientific materialism, has ended up formulating lots of very exotic, at the very least, explanations, but some of which are clearly unparsimonious. The multiverse requires not only believing in all those other billions of universes, so many that we could allegedly render the existence of a universe with our improbable fine-tuning parameters probable in some possible universe. But in order to have any plausibility, it must invoke a universe-generating mechanism so that it can portray our universe as the lucky winner of a great cosmic lottery. When you look at those universe-generating mechanisms, whether they're based on string theory or inflationary cosmology, or it turns out you need both, you have to affirm the existence of multiple theoretical entities, inflaton fields, multi-dimensions of space, beyond the 3 or 4 dimensions that we know of space-time, and many, many other theoretical entities, and I enumerate them in the book. I think we got to at least 10. So you have 10 pure theoretical postulates for which we can have no direct knowledge or empirical support, versus the single hypothesis of a transcendent designer. So I would assert and have argued that the theistic design hypothesis is much more parsimonious in explanation for these fundamental, what we've discovered about biological and cosmological origins than the modern scientific materialist perspective, or the explanations that scientific materialists are generating. That's the one part of the question. The other part is about intelligent design or theistic design explaining too much, and there is some force to that, but I think it misses the crucial point. You don't elect an explanation, you don't affirm an explanation unless you can also affirm that it's best, that it provides better explanatory power than its competitors. If it were the case that materialistic explanations, for example, let's just go to, say, chemical evolutionary theory, if a materialistic explanation for the origin of the information necessary to build the first cell was sufficient, if we had a known naturalistic way of generating information and informational codes and processing systems, then the postulation of intelligent design would be superfluous. It might still be a possible explanation, but we couldn't conceive of it as the best explanation. So it's not the case that intelligent design or even a theistic design hypothesis will always be the superior explanation. That depends on the evidence. It's always a possible explanation, but whether or not it's best does depend on what is contingent on the evidential pattern, the fact pattern that we have in front of us, what we observe about nature. So it's not tautological, which is, I think, the sense of the opposition, or which is the force of the objection that you're formulating. It really depends on the evidence, and the argument that I made is that the evidence supports both intelligent design simpliciter, intelligent design of in one context, a designing mind of some kind, and in a broader context, a theistic designer.
So if I could, if I were to restate that, especially the first.
There's nothing to repeat.
Excuse my phone. Excuse my phone. It's in my lap. So if I were to repeat that, I would say what you've said is that when you have these 10 other naturalistic hypotheses, and then you have ID, the intelligent design to explain the fine-tuning of the cosmos. So you have essentially 11 hypotheses. But with intelligent design, you also have the added benefit that its explanatory scope is broader than these others. So
yeah, it explains other things than what the multiverse was invented to explain, but it explains the thing that the multiverse was invented to explain more simply than the multiverse. And in fact, it does so more adequately, because the multiverse requires these universe-generating mechanisms as a condition of its plausibility. And the universe-generating mechanisms themselves require, even in theory, the ones that have been formulated require prior unexplained fine-tuning to generate new universes. So the fine-tuning hasn't even been ultimately explained in the multiverse scenario. So I think it's deficient on several counts. But it's certainly not simpler than theistic design.
Now I'm channeling the spirit of Richard Dawkins. He's speaking through me right now.
Yeah,
and of course he's going to say, simpler, how dare you say that? God is infinitely complex. So any universe generating machine is going to be infinitely less complex than deity.
Every philosopher of science or logician knows that Dawkins is equivocating there in an egregious manner, because the notion of simplicity in the context of explanation refers to the idea that you are, quote, not multiplying explanatory postulates or entities. Going back to Occam, it's a matter of how many postulates are you having to formulate to explain the same evidence or the relevant evidence. So God, you can say the same thing of human beings. Human beings are extremely complex, but sometimes human action or human choice is the best explanation for a given phenomenon. If you look at the Rosetta Stone in the British Museum, one of my favorite examples, you can make an inference to intelligent design. In fact, the archaeologists who discovered that the inscriptions were three different ways of describing the same events in three different languages realized that this was these were informational inscriptions, so they inferred intelligence, not wind and erosion. But the scribe who was responsible for that was clearly a complex being. Having an intelligent mind makes you complex in that sense, but the postulation of the action of such a being was not complex. It was a simple explanation because it posited one thing, the causal powers of which we know well from experience, that was capable of explaining the effect.
I think I've exhausted my questions. Arjuna, do you got something?
Yeah, I thought might take a minute to think of something.
Well, while you do that, I actually did. I didn't want to switch the topics, but you brought up Imre Lakatos. And just speaking of the demarcation problem, Lakatos is the only sort of somewhat solution that I could see to forming some sort of positive definition of what makes a natural science a natural science. And I was curious what your opinions on him were.
Yeah, I like Lakatos. I think he's had some very good insights. He was one of the philosophers of science who was trying to characterize science more accurately as it became apparent that the Popperian falsification criterion fails. And another philosopher in that same philosopher of science, and that a little bit before him, was Michael Polanyi. In 1959, he wrote Personal Knowledge. Lakatos's work was in the 60s. Lakatos had the idea of a research program, and the idea that, we don't falsify things by a single failed experiment, but you have a kind of, he characterized what he called a degenerate research program, where you have anomalies that accumulate over time, and finally people realize, hey, we're failing to meet the Occam criterion of parsimony, and that given that we have all of us, some sort of deep-seated assumption in the intelligibility, rationality, and simplicity or coherence of nature, we shouldn't be having such incoherent, convoluted explanations to try to make sense of what we're seeing. And so eventually scientists give up on research programs that are theories that require this constant adjustment with multiple auxiliary hypotheses, especially if the auxiliary hypotheses themselves are pure postulates and have no evidence in support of them. So I think it's a good way of characterizing how science does progress.
Yeah, and on that category, how would you see intelligent design progressing as a research program that works?
Yeah, I think very well. In fact, intelligent design has gone through several phases, and we have a research project that we have initiated at Discovery starting in 2016. We call it Intelligent Design 3.0. Intelligent Design 1.0 kind of started before intelligent design was actually formulated, and that was the growing scientific critique of neo-Darwinism and chemical evolutionary theory. So a critique of the existing models existed. It was building even before we started to formulate an alternative. In the 90s, we got books like The Design Inference by William Dembski, the Darwin's Black Box by Michael Behe. Some of my books, The Signature in the Cell and Darwin's Doubt, came a little bit later, but they were all kind of trying to do the same thing, which was to show the explanatory power of the design perspective vis-a-vis facts that we already had on the table, facts that were anomalous from within a neo-Darwinian or chemical evolutionary approach to biological origins. Now I think we're entering a phase where the concept of intelligent design reasoning, our knowledge of design patterns that we can derive from, say, high-tech digital computing, and that where a design pattern is an established method of storing or transmitting digital code or processing digital information, that our knowledge of what designers do and the concept of intelligent design and our ability to detect it is allowing us to make predictions about what we ought to find in biological systems if, in fact, intelligent design played a role, as opposed to a bottom-up Darwinian or chemical evolutionary explanation. And there have been, in Signature in the Cell, I sketched out 10 predictions that would flow from the idea of intelligent design. And there have been more that have been generated since then. And many of them are being confirmed by actual scientific research. A very exciting prediction I talked a minute ago about the junk DNA. Our ID proponents, Dean Kenyon, William Dembski, Richard Sternberg, who was sympathetic to ID, entertaining the idea, and is now very firmly supportive. But these were some of the scientists who first proposed that the non-coding regions of the DNA, the so-called junk, according to neo-Darwinists, would turn out not to be junk at all, but would be importantly functional. And that prediction has been confirmed by, among other things, this massive ENCODE project that in the federal science establishment that has established that the non-coding regions are importantly functional, and overall they're functioning much like an operating system in a computer, where they are controlling the timing and the expression of the coding files, of the files that do code for proteins. Another exciting prediction of an intelligent design proponent, Siegfried Scherer, is that we would find overlapping genes, that there would be a design pattern that we recognize from computer science is the ability to embed messages in other messages. And he went out looking for overlapping genes and found them, and has published over a dozen peer-reviewed papers establishing the existence of multiple reading frames and multiple messages layered on top of each other, which is pretty hard to explain from any kind of evolutionary point of view. How do you get an undirected process to satisfy that many semantic constraints simultaneously? We've got projects on what are called waiting times. We have a project on orphan genes, which is another interesting phenomenon that's predicted by intelligent design, but is completely inconsistent with a Darwinian view of things. So I think the ID program is moving from merely a critique of Darwinism into offering an alternative explanatory framework, and now into generating new predictions and new hypotheses. In other words, we're moving into we're seeing evidence of a maturing intellectual program that has heuristic value, that is to say, the theory is functioning as a guide to discovery. One of the things that Lakatos highlighted as a hallmark of a healthy and dynamic scientific research program.
So if I could switch back, Arjuna, did you have something?
There's a few questions we could go through.
Okay, I'll stow mine for now.
All right, there's not so many. I guess the argument would be science needs to presuppose a mechanism for an explanation. So what mechanism did God use to create life, and how can we know it?
And that's a common question. I think that mechanism is a special case of causation. There are causes that are mechanical. There are causes that are mental. Agents cause things to happen by virtue of their choice and action. And so intelligent design does not propose a mechanism by which God created the universe, or by which intelligent agents generate information generally. We can know that intelligence was responsible for, say, the Rosetta Stone, without knowing whether the scribe used a chisel or a hammer or a sharp rock or something else. We can often know, we can infer the action of a cause without always knowing its mode of what Aristotle would call its efficiency. We don't know necessarily the mechanism always. So we can say we don't know to the question of mechanism, or say, here's another take on that. You just asked me a question. I know that the question came from your mind. You conveyed information in a discernible way. You caused sound waves to oscillate and so forth. But what triggered my awareness of the mental causation was your use of established English syntax and grammar. And so I know that your mind was ultimately responsible for what you asked me, but I don't really know how mind affects matter. This is what's called the mind-body problem. We don't know that for human agency. And so we can infer that a mind played a role without exactly knowing how or by what mechanism minds affect matter at that interface between mind and brain. So answer to that question, how did God, by what mechanism did he use? We probably will just say we don't know, but that doesn't make the inference to the activity of a designing mind, or even a transcendent designing mind, illegitimate.
If I could throw something in, I kind of chuckled when the question came in, because I was about 2 hours ago in a Zoom call with 5 or 6 PhD students in philosophy of science, and we actually had a debate whether or not scientific theories needed to postulate a mechanism. And the go-to example is, of course, Newtonianism, the sort of paradigm of a scientific explanation. Newton didn't have a mechanism for gravity.
He absolutely did not have a mechanism. He was opposed by the mechanical philosophers who believed that you had to have a mechanistic cause for a theory to be legitimate. I mean, Newtonian physics is the paradigm example of a legitimate scientific theory, and was so for hundreds of years. But we have a bad history of science thinking that Newton was the architect of the mechanistic universe. In fact, your earlier quote is the one that's apt: hypothesis non fingo. To bring it more up to date, Stephen Gould used to bristle at the idea that punctuated equilibrium wasn't a legitimate scientific theory because he lacked a mechanism for the evolutionary changes that he postulated. He said you can know that something has occurred without always knowing how it has occurred. And you could have a theory that affirms that something happened, or in a certain way. For him, it was the abrupt appearance of new fossil forms in the fossil record. He proposed a mechanism called species selection, but it was roundly rejected by his colleagues as inadequate. But he said that doesn't mean that punctuated equilibrium as an overall framework is not a legitimate scientific theory for understanding the history of life. So this is, again, an attempt to universalize a feature of some systems or of some theories, and to require that feature to be present or applicable in all theories. And I think, again, it fails to capture the diversity of methods and the diversity of things that scientists are doing when they're trying to understand the natural world. It's also, again, trying to settle the debate by reference to an abstraction rather than by reference to the relevant evidence. Well, it has to have this characteristic or I'm not going to think about it. At the end of the day, I think the demarcation program is a product of some intellectual laziness.
Arpit, who asked the first question as a follow-up, but then it is unreasonable on the part of ID proponents to ask for the mechanism behind the naturalistic emergence of consciousness from matter. I guess you could say the same thing about the neo-Darwinian mechanism, or how natural processes evolve life.
Well, I don't think it's unreasonable to ask any question, but if you're proposing a naturalistic explanation and you don't have a naturalistic explanation or a naturalistic mechanism, then your program's in trouble. But if you're proposing a different kind of explanation, an explanation by reference to agency or mind or conscious activity, and you don't have a mechanistic explanation, your program's not in trouble because you weren't purporting to provide that type of an explanation.
I guess the feature that you're attributing to intelligence is the purposeful arrangement of matter. We often, anytime we see odds defied and arranging information, say it's performed by a mind. Therefore, when we find that in DNA, we infer that a mind was the cause. We don't have to know how it was done. Like if we find some alien technology, like some spaceship, and we find it's able to teleport or something, we have no idea how it's able to do it. We don't know what the mechanism is. We know that it's able to do it, and we can see features there that it was designed by an intelligence. So we have no idea how they created it or what technology they used, but we can know that it was created by an intelligence and that it does work.
That's again, very well said, Arjuna. I would, in my books, Behe defines the effect of interest, the purposeful arrangement of parts, which I think is a good rough and ready way of getting at evidence of design. I think using some of Dembski's formalism and notions from the information sciences, in my books, I zero in on a particular kind of information that you could call specified information or functional information or complex specified information, and I define that very carefully as the effect that needs explanation in the biological realm, and it's that effect that I argue is produced by one and only one kind of a cause, and that is self-conscious agency or intelligence. The famed information scientists from the early 60s who first began to apply information theory to molecular biology, Henry Quasler, said, the creation of new information is habitually associated with conscious activity. So we know what it means to be consciously aware and deliberative and make choices in accord with our deliberations. That's what I mean by intelligence. And we know about that from direct introspective experience. And no materialist can really object to that idea, because you can't even formulate monistic or physicalist theories of mind without using your own deliberative capabilities as a self-conscious agent. It becomes profoundly self-contradictory. So it's not an incoherent or spooky idea. Intelligence or self-conscious deliberation or agency these are not spooky notions. I would argue we know about the powers of our own agency better than we know anything else. Everything else we know indirectly by inference. Anything we know about the physical world, we know about the powers of our own agency by direct introspective experience. And that's part of reality. But by the way, that's one of the reasons that Thomas Nagel, the famed atheist philosopher of mind, ended up rejecting Darwinism, is that he thought it had no account his book title was Mind and Cosmos. And he said, yeah, the Darwinian, the materialist framework is aware of the cosmos, but it has to discount the reality of mind. And yet that's part of our experience. It's part of what we know as part of reality. And we have to reckon with that.
So what's interesting, before we move on to the next question, is I know we've sort of, pushed aside the falsification principle, but it seems like what you proposed with that was it specified information is highly falsifiable. If the claim is here's a feature of reality, there's one explanation we know can account for it, that seems highly falsifiable. Go out and find another naturalistic account for why this could arise.
Yeah, show us a process that produces this effect, and then intelligent design can no longer be considered the best explanation. It might still be considered a possible explanation because we do know that minds produce this effect. And in a sense, that earlier question you asked about, design or intelligence can always be invoked as an explanation, is actually telegraphing weakness in the whole materialistic system of thought, because what it's really tacitly acknowledging is that minds have capabilities that what Newton called brute matter does not. Mind has capabilities, our minds have capabilities that purely materialistic objects do not. And when we find evidence of the distinctive product of mind in the absence of observing a cause behind it, because we weren't there to see it, it's a perfectly reasonable inference to infer back to the activity of a mind. So I think this gets to what I think is maybe the fundamental revolutionary idea in the ID movement, is that mind is a reality. It has real powers that we know that exceed the powers of matter and energy. It produces distinctive effects that allow us to detect its activity. And since it's part of reality, we need to be open to evidence of the activity of mind when we find those distinctive products of mind.
Yeah, the illustration I've used in the past is if I'm walking through a forest, the shape of any one of the rocks could theoretically be the product of mind, but that doesn't discount my inference whenever I see an arrowhead.
Correct. That's a good illustration.
Oh, thank you.
I saw some other good questions flashing up there. By the way, gentlemen, this is a fantastic discussion because I think it highlights how much this discussion about design, intelligent design, Darwinism, chemical evolution, theism, and materialism really trades on underlying issues in the philosophy of science. We've had a lot of bad positivist philosophy of science that has driven at least the rhetorical objections to intelligent design. And when you put the discussion in the right context, the right philosophy of science context, suddenly the design research program seems a lot more plausible. And I think that's coming out of this discussion quite nicely. Anyway, there was another question I saw flash on the screen.
Philosophy of mind is also an important thing here too. Like this mechanistic idea, I guess it started with Descartes that, there's physical world and then there's, the spiritual world, and they're completely separate. And then science just went on its way studying mechanisms. And then eventually we decided matter was all that existed. And that became the prevailing view. But epistemologically, we start with mind. That's the epistemic prior. And matter is just an inference from there. So this idea that mind is fundamental isn't really that wacky when you actually look at the philosophy seriously. And also we've got things like the Pierre's Lab research, where at Princeton University, they found that people meditating, willing for a random event generator to skew in a certain direction, were able to influence random events, even with marble machines, not just quantum processors. So, we don't have a mechanism for that, but we have data that shows that minds can influence matter.
Well, and we have in quantum physics the whole phenomenon of the collapse of the wave function, and the idea that the fundamental units of matter are smeared out in a possibility space until they're observed, which there's lots of different interpretations of what that that collapse means, but one of my colleagues at Discovery, George Gilder, has said that at the heart of the quantum revolution has shown that the heart of matter lies a mystery. I mean, matter is the little tiny corpuscles of things that behave in really predictable ways is already an obsolete concept. So there's big issues there to discuss.
So UBI is asking question for both Stephen and Seth. What do you think about deism or some designer starting the universe and the origin of life?
Yeah. Should I take a whack at it first, Seth, and then you want to chime in?
Yeah, absolutely.
In my new book, I address multiple competing metaphysical hypotheses: theism, deism, pantheism, materialism, also panentheism, panpsychism. I have some long footnotes about there's different systems of thought. Deism, I think, is explanatorily adequate. It provides a causally adequate explanation for the origin of the universe and possibly the fine-tuning of the universe. But it does not provide a good explanation for any evidence of design that we see arising long after the beginning of the universe. So the evidence of design we have in biology that comes online maybe 10 billion years after the Big Bang with the origin of the first life on Earth, that's hard to explain from a deistic point of view. Some have posited a front-end loaded sort of design where all of the elementary particles of the universe were configured in just the right way to ensure that we'd get DNA molecules chock full with information necessary to build prokaryotic cells. But I show in the book, for a number of reasons, that's scientifically extremely implausible. In particular, the chemical subunits of DNA and by themselves do not have within them self-organizing properties that determine the informational sequences of DNA. So even if you started with a prebiotic soup of sugars, phosphates, and bases, the chemical interactions between those would not self-organize into information-rich genes that could produce biologically relevant, for example, proteins. I then argue, if that's the case, and I think I can show that is, then it's certainly, if the information needed to build the first living cell isn't inherent in the more complex chemical subunits and more complex and biologically relevant subunits of DNA, then it certainly wasn't present in the elementary particles at the beginning of the universe, especially when we consider that we didn't even have atoms until 380,000 years after the Big Bang. You had to cool from the plasma state. So I don't think the front-end loaded ideas of design to explain the design in biology are plausible. And I go into that in a lot more detail in chapter 15 of my new book, Return of the God Hypothesis. So deism can explain, in principle, could explain the origin of the universe and its fine-tuning, but not the evidence of biological design that arises long after the beginning.
Yeah. And I haven't really showed my hands, as Arjuna knows well. I actually have made peace with Darwinian evolution, but on the condition, and this is the center of my research right now, on the condition that it's grounded on a classical theistic version of God. So it's kind of, my project right now is very apologetic. It's more of a heads I win, tails you lose sort of strategy. It's either ID or theistic evolution. And that's where I'm at right now. And it's exactly for the same reasons. This is why I'm sympathetic with ID. Some of ID's arguments is because the only mechanism that I could see accounting for some of these features would be something closer to vitalism, that you have some other principle that the materialists are not allowing in. And I actually argue that Darwin himself smuggled this in his talk of final causes. And the whole point of the project is to show distinctly how the philosophy of Darwinism itself does not work without a medieval view of causation, which has God as hierarchy.
You're getting some sort of active shaping of matter from some vital spirit on an ongoing basis, something like that. Is that what you're?
Well, I wouldn't say a vital spirit. That feels a bit
vital principle, or
yeah. So because the way I like to frame it is God is life, and life needs to be seen as a teleological principle. And the problem with modern day Darwinism is it usually only looks at efficient material causes. When you leave out the final cause, which Darwin himself did not, I think James Lennox has shown that pretty thoroughly. Darwinism itself does not make sense. And then here's the next thing: final causation itself has yet to be shown to work except in a theistic universe. I think Nagel gave a valiant attempt, and from hearsay now, he's beginning to realize that his system itself requires God. But that's just from pure hearsay that I know from people who've talked to him.
I had an interesting conversation with him. Wonderful man, by the way, just a deeply reflective guy. But that was the second question he asked me, which was, do you think my notion of naturalistic teleology is incoherent? And I wasn't going to tell the great man that it was incoherent, but and it may not be. But what I said is I don't think it passes the test of experience. We don't know anything that has purposes that was not designed by an intelligent agent. I mean, purposes derive from agency. They don't derive from pure brute matter. So.
Yeah, and I think that's why you have to just sneak this in, because when you look at how like Aristotle uses agency, I mean, he would talk about the agency of rocks. He would talk about the agency of everything. I mean, he didn't use rocks, for example. He talks about the elementals and stuff like that. But final causation, this agency, this mental aspect, he was very much had to be interpreted as a panpsychist because he had to put it in everywhere. And I think that's honestly the thesis is if you want a Darwinian evolution, you have to go where Darwin and Aristotle went. So Etienne Gilson,
I would dispute the idea that Darwin really went there, but he might have talked out of two sides of his mouth as well. But I mean, the denial of design, which is essential to the Darwinian account of natural selection, the reason you don't have design is that nature is doing the selecting, I think precludes teleology. Now, I think he did subtly, he was forced to subtly work it back in, but official Darwinism is not open to teleology. What you need, in addition to Darwinism, is something teleological, and that I think does involve mind. So I think you're right, but I think that that what Darwin believed is maybe harder to characterize than people think. You know? Anyway,
it is.
It's a big subject. Yeah.
Yeah, and I'll just say this to clarify.
Top of the hour, so yeah.
Yeah, I'll just say this. I think he smuggled in purpose. I don't think he smuggled in design. And I think there was a very sort of rough distinction in his mind there.
Yeah, he imputes a kind of impulse to organisms towards survival, which is teleological.
Yeah.
So yeah, I get you.
I probably should have brought this up.
Great discussion. Yeah.
I probably should have brought this up earlier, but Seth did a post on his Facebook page a few months back asking for definitions of pseudoscience. And I think this was the best comment. So the question I should have asked at the beginning is, here's the definition of pseudoscience. And let's see if this is actually accurate or if there's some substance to the demarcation.
Yeah, this is,
so Jonathan Lionheart, who's actually Seth's brother-in-law. I went to high school with this guy, actually. That's how I got to know Seth. I found it's useful to define as scientific whatever fits into my presuppositions and to dismiss as pseudoscientific whatever seems inconvenient for those presuppositions. Does that make sense? It's okay if it doesn't, because I'll just ignore you.
There's a man with the courage of his convictions. I appreciate that. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, that's what's going on rhetorically. It's used as a invective or pejorative against people with whom you disagree, and it's treated as a way of circumventing the need to actually argue with the people with whom you disagree, which I think is anti-intellectual.
Yeah, I was having this discussion with somebody in comments, and they eventually were like, okay, that's fine. Let's just call it bad science. It's okay with me if you want to call it bad science. But the thing there is that's a concession. And instead of saying it's not a debate we can have because it's not a scientific topic, it's now saying it's a debate that's been had and lost, or, it's a debate that can be had. And I think the evidence doesn't stack up on its side, which is then a scientific discussion. Then it's about looking at the evidence and the arguments.
Exactly. Yeah. I'm happy to call some things bad science if by that we mean they're unlikely to be true given the evidence that we have.
I'll just check if there's any. So I generally go 2 hours. I don't know how you guys are going for time. We're at 90 minutes now.
How are you, Professor Meyer?
Yeah, I probably need to wrap things up within another 10 or so, if we can do that.
Okay, and someone else is asking, I guess it's a falsification question. So how could you rule out the idea that God created the first life?
How could I rule out the idea? Well, I wouldn't rule out the idea. I'm open to the idea. The question is, how could you detect, what kind of positive evidence could you offer in support of the idea that there was a designing intelligence? And the positive evidence that I would offer would be the presence in living systems of features that are, from our independent experience, only known to have arisen from the activity of a designing intelligence. So, yeah, I think the question does presuppose that falsification is a normative way of defining science. So,
yeah, and I might add ruling out.
Not willing to play that game, as I indicated before.
Yeah, and I might say ruling out what is meant by that, because science doesn't deal in certainties. It just opts for the better hypothesis, right? So if a simpler, say, naturalistic hypothesis for the origin of life was given,
simpler and more causally adequate. Exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
You point to a process that generates the features that we see in living systems, and we know of the power of that process from independent experience, then I've got to take that seriously, and then I may not have the best explanation by invoking intelligent design. But, there is a point where you want to ask people to step back and say, think about what was discovered in the 1950s, 60s, 70s, and right up to the present inside living cells. Nobody expected digital code. I mean, one of our top biotech specialists here in the Seattle area, Leroy Hood, says DNA contains digital code. And it's not just that it contains the code is being stored and transmitted and processed in the context of a highly sophisticated digital information processing system. There are discernible design patterns that we know from high-tech digital computing involved in the processing of that information. We've got automated error correction at work inside living cells in the gene expression system. We have overlapping genes, therefore nested coding of information, a recognizable design pattern, and on it goes. So we're dealing with an effect that should shock us into recognition of the activity of a mind. This is really not that hard. If you found this type of effect in any other realm of experience, you would know immediately that a mind had been at work.
One way of answering
should have been a stop-press moment. It is and should be a stop-press moment in the history of science and biology. We opened up the cell and discovered it's a digital information processing system. Dawkins himself this summer had a tweet in response to an Aussie group that had animated, I think it was the DNA replication system, but one of the parts of the information processing in the cell. And he said he was knocked sideways with wonder at the intricacy of this digital information processing system at work within the cell. And then he went on to say something about how wonderful it was that scientists had worked it all out. Well, yeah, absolutely. It's wonderful that scientists have worked it all out. But that dodges the big question, which is, how did it get here? The origins question. He has no explanation for that, and he's acknowledged that. Because it's essentially a question of the origin of life. And the reason we don't have an explanation for the origin of life is we have no explanation for how you get from chemistry to code. And that is a gap that has not gotten any closer to being closed in 70 years of origin of life research.
They can't even escape the design inference and how they speak about their own theory. Like, that they basically talk about nature as if it's a designer, the wonders of the designs of the natural processes.
Gary Fodor.
They might say that it's a language problem, but I think it's a concept problem, that the concepts are of design, that's the natural conclusion. So they always end up talking that way just because that's the reality of the concepts.
Yeah, there's a wonderful historian of science at Stanford, Timothy Lenoir. Don't know if he's still there, but he's wrote a book about the role of teleology in biology. And he said, that teleology has been rejected as a mode of explanation or understanding in the biological sciences. And yet at every turn, biological scientists are hard pressed to describe the systems inside living organisms in a way that doesn't impute teleology to them. And you see this especially in molecular biology, where we've got replication and we've got coding, and we've got the genetic code, we've got the genetic text, we've got replication, we've got information processing. That's the reason we describe it that way, is that that's what's actually happening. So this ought to wake us up.
One way of answering the falsification argument too is an idea doesn't need to be falsifiable. I don't need to prove something wrong. Something doesn't need to be capable of being proven wrong in order to be a theory worth entertaining. It's just that I need to have reasons for believing it which are falsifiable. So if there's reasons for believing it which can be falsified, then you can have a valid design inference.
So that's a very good point. But that's another one of the subtleties that are lost in these demarcation arguments.
Cool. That's it for questions. So, do you guys have any final comments?
One other of the most common demarcation arguments you hear is that intelligent design isn't scientific because it invokes an unobservable entity, and science is about observing nature. Well, yes, science does involve observing nature, but scientists often infer unobservable entities in order to explain what they observe. And so science is, I like to say, indirectly inferential. You infer that entity or postulate those entities which, if true, would best explain the evidence. And so no one has seen directly a quark or even an electron. We don't see the subsurface of the Earth, but we infer its structure from seismic studies. We didn't directly see the DNA molecule. The structure of that was inferred from X-ray crystallography and studies of biochemistry, in the piecing together of models to explain an array of data. So, and in the historical sciences, we don't see the Big Bang. We don't see past mutational events. We don't see past inferred transitional intermediate species. All these things are inferred from things we can see. So this idea that simply because something is unobservable, a theory that affirms such an unobservable is therefore unscientific, is an unsustainable objection. It would disqualify theoretical physics, evolutionary biology, cosmology, geology, psychology, and a whole bunch of other sciences. So this again illustrates the futility of these demarcation arguments, but that's one of the most common ones. And it's also one of the things that hangs people up about even considering intelligent design. They think, well, because I don't see the activity of an agent in the past, I don't see a mental event, and therefore I can't consider it. Well, again, we often infer the activity of minds based on the effects that minds leave behind that are distinctive of mental activity.
I'd like to ask one more question.
Sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So you've told us a little bit about what the Discovery Institute and ID sort of is focusing on. But now that your book is published, I wanted to end by asking, what about you personally? What's the next thing that we can expect from Dr. Stephen Meyer?
Well, right now I'm attempting to, in a sense, translate the message of the book into some other media. We have a whole series of videos that we've produced called Science Uprising. 3 of them concern the Big Bang, the fine-tuning, and the origin of the information necessary to build life. We have a theatrical release documentary that we're working on, and we have I've got just actually on December 20th there'll be a 5-part series based on my new book, released with the PragerU people. They have these short 5-minute videos. And so it's a 5-part series on the scientific case for the existence of God. So in a sense, I've been thinking about the big book project for 35 years. I finally finished it earlier in the year. I know that big books with as many footnotes and as many objections that I answer are not always everybody's cup of tea. So we're also trying to translate the message into some more accessible formats at this point, or ways of understanding it. So that's something I'm working on right now. But that after you finish a big one like that, it takes a while to regroup before you think about another big book project. So
cool. One final comment I want to make is I think this discussion is largely impeded, or a consequent, the quality of this discussion in the public sphere is suffering from the state of philosophy and the attitudes towards it, which have gone on in the last 100 years. So previously, philosophers were like rock stars. I said this to Graham Oppie, I can't remember the example he gave. I think it was Immanuel Kant. Like when he was on his deathbed, there were like crowds gathering to see him for the last time. That's how big philosophy was back then. Whereas these days,
100 years ago, Henri Bergson, a philosopher no one knows about today, caused the first traffic jam in New York history.
I did not know. Yeah, there's something to say about this because, our friends on the other side of this metaphysical divide, the scientific materialists, Hawking, certainly Dawkins, especially Lawrence Krauss, will say that philosophy is a pointless, worthless discipline, that philosophy is not something that has any merit or value. But they do a lot of philosophy. They just do it, I think, badly because they're operating out of a materialistic framework. And it's materialism that made philosophy disreputable, because materialism wanted to add the very simplistic philosophy that the only thing we're talking about is matter and energy, and we can explain everything, all of our experiences and all phenomena in relation to that. And if we don't explain it, quote unquote, scientifically, by which they meant materialistically, then we haven't said anything that is meaningful. But that is a statement of one of the worst philosophies of science that has come along in the 20th century, which is logical positivism. When something is empirically verifiable or logically undeniable, it doesn't have any meaning. And of course, that statement itself turned out to be self-contradictory. And so it's not that we no longer do philosophy, it's that materialistic philosophy is not very credible when you look at it carefully. And the scientists who disclaim philosophy as legitimate are doing philosophy, but doing it very badly. So I'd cause a traffic jam to meet Graham Oppie or William Lane Craig. Oh, very good.
Oh, you can't see the emojis. Well, what you have going on, like philosophy is like psychology. Even if you don't think about it, you have a philosophy. Even if you don't study psychology, you have a psychology. And what goes on these days is a lot of people get their philosophy from people who have not trained in philosophy, haven't studied it, and haven't examined it. They're getting it from scientists. And, it might be something like a kind of nourishment that we intellectually need. We need something to fill that hole in our brains, that we need to put a philosophy in there. And science has replaced philosophy as the thing that's going to answer all the deep and meaningful questions about life. So people are getting all those answers from scientists who are making philosophical pronouncements while not having training in philosophy,
without knowing it or
knowing
it or acknowledging them. Yeah,
and engaging in none of the rigor of the discipline of philosophy. Whereas previously, philosophers, it's a very rigorous discipline. If you want to enter philosophy today, I mean, there is definitely philosophy going on these days, and there's a high bar for entry for some subjects. You study extensively. You got to know all the literature. If you want to argue a case, you've got to answer all the objections. And it's a community of people that love truth. They're not just like raising objections because they're trying to annoy you. It's like genuine things for the most part that need to be considered. There might be some of it which is just trolling.
I agree with that. You got to put on your big boy pants or big girl pants and your thinking cap to do good philosophy. And simply the kind of reflexive knee-jerk positivism that you get from a lot of science popularizers is a very poor philosophy. But it is, as we've been talking about for an hour and 45 minutes now, it's the source of many of these facile objections to intelligent design that are flowing out of those philosophical frameworks of simplistic materialism, logical positivism, and this whole failed demarcation idea that you can define science in a simplistic way and settle all questions by seeing if the theory in question does or does not fit with your definition. That we need to put to bed once and for all.
Well, following on from that, there's a demarcation question that perhaps we do need to put more energy into, which is what's science and what's philosophy? And if you're going to make philosophical statements, then maybe there's some rigor you need to engage in. Just like we have that for science, you can't just go out there and call yourself a doctor and start prescribing medicine. You go to jail. So maybe we need something like that for philosophy. Maybe not quite as extreme.
You want to turn it around and ask the scientists whether or not they rise to the level of rigor that is required to be considered a philosopher.
There we go. Yeah.
I'm a philosopher of science, so I try to straddle the line, and then maybe even argue that there is not a clear line between them. It's all about trying to use our best thinking to come to the truth.
I think
whatever we end up
some line. I mean, you could have someone who builds a bridge. That's science. That the engineering of that, and they don't do any philosophy. They're like, I can tell you if you put these materials together, it builds a bridge. I can't tell you what it means, whether you should value the bridge or why it's the case.
Yeah, there are certainly different types of questions, and there are certainly different subject matter. I think you can make demarcations based on subjects of interest. So. I'm a geologist is different than I'm a biologist because I'm looking at rocks rather than life. I'm doing natural theology rather than science because I'm interested in rather than physics because I'm interested in whether or not there was a God that explains what I see in the natural world. I mean, there are some rough and ready distinctions you can obviously make, but you can't settle questions by definitions. That's the main moral of this story.
Now, Professor Meyer, I know you said 10 minutes, and I think it's been 15. Are we keeping you?
I probably ought to scoot. I'm running a little behind everything else, although I love this conversation.
Yeah. It's been an honor having you on and a pleasure. Thank you.
Yeah.
It would be helpful to your audience to be able to take a deeper dive on this. My book, Signature in the Cell, has 2 chapters on this demarcation issue that probably plumb this as deeply as I've done. And I think that there are chapters 17, 17, 18, and 19 would be. So if people want to get a hold of that, there's some. I look at some reasonable, positive definitions of what science is. I think you can say science is an organized form of inquiry. It has certain basic characteristics, and then I show that ID meets those. But if you then say, well, but it's not science because of these defeaters, these demarcation arguments, then you get into a whole bunch of trouble and they don't really work. And so anyway, that might, if people want to get a more systematic acquaintance with my thought on this, I do develop that in a lot of detail in the latter chapters of Signature in the Cell.
All right, I'll put a link to that in the video description.
Yeah, and best of luck causing a traffic jam at your next speaking event.
Well, or my funeral, I don't know. So,
oh gosh.
Hope we don't go there, right?
Oh no.
Yeah. All right, guys. Well, thank you very much for the very stimulating and deep conversation. This is, I assume you'll share the link because we'd like to push this out to people that are interested.
I'll send you the link out by email, and we'll wrap it up there. Thanks again, guys. And
all right. Very good.
For everyone,
we'll try to connect down under if I get to New Zealand again. So
yeah, that would be great. It would be an honor. And for everyone watching, if you like this kind of stuff, be sure to subscribe. We've got more of these things coming out. Next week, me and Seth are debating evidence for reincarnation on Capturing Christianity, so that should be fun. Today we're friends, but next week we're enemies. You can see us flip. And be sure to give us a like to help us in the algorithm and let us know what you think in the comments. And I'll see you in the next one. Hare Krishna.
Thank you, guys. Take care.
All right.